Hello, it's Richard Bawden again in this mini-series podcast on getting to better together. In the introduction to this series, I presented the arguments of why we believe this idea of A, getting to better, and B, having to do that together was important. And among the other issues that I tackled was the importance of judgment and listening to people's answers to questions like, what does constitute better? Who decides what's better? Who has to act? And obviously, therefore, it is important for us to hear different voices in relation to questions like that. I'm delighted to have a conversation this morning with Maria Raciti. She is both a professor of marketing at the University of the Sunshine Coast and director of the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre here. So in my first introductory episode, I mentioned the importance of worldview. That is, our particular sets of beliefs and assumptions about how the world operates, how we know how the world operates, and so on. And I made the point that I found it really important to understand that A, I have a particular set of worldviews, and that others have different worldviews, and that can lead to considerable conflict. And this is particularly so when it comes to intercultural affairs. Now, Maria stood me up this morning and said, maybe that's not important. Maybe it's not important to have worldviews or to know about them. We have them. So challenge me, Maria.
Thank you, Richard. I guess the challenge I had was this idea of, do we need to be conscious of our worldviews? Because many of us are not, and it's whether that actually is a problem. Ignorance is bliss. And then when you are conscious of your worldviews, that brings with it a burden for a lot of people because you can't unsee what you've seen. And that might be something that, torments or inhibits people over their time because they're consciously overthinking or thinking, why am I doing what I'm doing, rather than this sort of connection between cognition and action and sort of that being an intimate relationship. That was the challenge I had is knowing better than not knowing, and whether we should consider it. Maybe there's just not a one-size-fits-all approach for everybody.
So what would that actually mean in practice? If we take something like nature and people's recognition of nature as either something over there, out there, or the alternative, we are an intrinsic part of nature and therefore we do what we do because we're nature, as it were.
So what I see with that is just that bipolar. It's one or the other, whereas I think it could be both, interlap and intersect, and also that at different points in our life, we may perceive it to be one and not the other. As children, for example, we may perceive ourselves to be distinct and different, but as we become older, we may see that we are part of it, simply as a function of the human experience of being on the planet longer. I think as an Aboriginal person, you grow into your Aboriginality. And so as you become older, as I've found, as I've become older, certain elements and aspects have been foregrounded that weren't there. They were perhaps they're hidden in the background, but as I've become older, they've become obvious and clear to me. I just don't think it's that hard and fast rules. I think that our worldviews change over time, and perhaps through our own reflections and reflective practice, perhaps through trauma and things that are put upon us. But there's always some circumstance that means that they change.
Yeah, I relate strongly to both of those, both to trauma and reflection. Tell me more about your own personal experiences, your own recognition of your self-Aboriginality, as it were.
So I was born in central Queensland in a small town. My parents were from northern Queensland. They had moved away. They wanted to start their own life in this space. So I didn't grow up on country, and I didn't grow up in culture because of that separation and that choice of it too. For a lot of Aboriginal people, that's not the case. There's fractured histories. There's stolen generations. There is no way to connect who you are to any past. You just know that you are, but what that means can be self-defined. So it comes down to that sense of the ascribed characteristic of what it is to be Aboriginal is, for me, self-defined. And And I think for others, that's been their journey as well, too. But as you get older, you come into it more because I think you've been on the planet long enough to start to really recognise racism and systemic barriers that were perhaps always there, that were always there, but you just never recognised them for what they were. And you also find voice. You become more confident. You see things that weren't there. So that's that sense of awakening and being woke. But that's also a process. And I think that has come with age. It hasn't been there from the outset because of my background and, and how, the sort of circumstances of my birth.
Thank you. People recognise trauma very easily, COVID-19 witness, that when things aren't going the way we expect them to or we hope them to, then we can recognise that as trauma. The issue of reflection, however, seems to me less common. So that people can experience trauma, but then either not be able to or not be willing to reflect. Yeah.
And I think even just this year has shown us that the extreme trauma of COVID, as you identified, we realised the systems around us, first of all, that there were systems around us that support our status quo. And I think the vast population then realised how fragile they were, but also how dependent we were on them. And our own almost sort of Pavlovian response to when tax cuts were announced and ways to stimulate the economy and just as we should, we went out and purchased, or as expected, we went out and purchased and all the rest of it. I think the interesting thing about reflection is that for some people it perhaps comes naturally, and that may be a personality trait, it may be something that they've done regularly. For others, I don't think it does. I also think it's the 21st century. We're so distracted. We're pulled in so many different directions, and we willingly go. A lot of the time we're moving at such fast pace that we don't have time to reflect on who we are and what we do and why we do. And I think sometimes that, as I mentioned before, like over one's life course, you just perhaps have more opportunities and spaces in between to reflect. And also this time of the year, around the end of the year and the beginning of the year, we have, I think, moments of reflection where people do take a little bit of time to sort of look at it. But just because you reflect and identify things that you want to change or things that would be better doesn't mean you actually do it. And I think that's just the nature of the human. We may know what's right, or we may identify things that we need to do, but we don't necessarily go about it. As a marketing person, I can guarantee you that's pretty much what we look at in marketing and consumer behaviour, that what people say they will do is often very different to what they will actually do.
And why is that?
There seems to be a disconnection between intention and actual behaviour. There's always some sort of mitigating factor that comes into it. And I think perhaps it's an optimism, perhaps it's an overpromising, and perhaps it, could be also a lack of self-awareness. People may be expressing a desire that they have versus, the need to actually take steps to purchase something or buy something or donate money or give blood. There's always some inhibiting factor that sits in the middle of it all. It's what we call in marketing the black box. And that's for a reason. We actually really haven't unpicked it yet.
Right. In terms of again, your own personal journey, so you started marketing without any deep sense of your Aboriginality. They came together, presumably, as you reflected more. And where did that then take you in terms of a new trajectory?
Yeah. So I think Aboriginality was always there because I'm conspicuously Aboriginal, and grew up and obviously always knew I always have identified, and that's been the case. But I think I moved into marketing because I was so intrigued by sort of this idea of creativity coming together with strategy. And no one ever said I couldn't. No one ever said, okay, most Indigenous students go into certain degrees, into teaching or into social work, for example, or into nursing. So I never had those constraints around me. So I was free to literally dream about what did I like, what did I want to do, and that's what I did, and that's when I pursued it. It's quite interesting because it probably wasn't until decades later that I realised that, actually, no, there sort of was an expectation that you went into certain degrees. The only real part of it was that I could give back, was that whatever I learned and whatever knowledge and skills I had, I could then give back to community in my own way as a way of helping others. other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. So I think that was always a part of what I was doing and why I was doing it. And Indigenous businesses have grown tenfold and are hugely successful around the country. They just don't seem to get the visibility that they should have and that they deserve.
The sense of artistry, of creativity that I certainly associate with Aborigines has always been a bit of a mystery to me, that there's this innate sense of creativity. Every Aboriginal I have ever met, not just here, but also in places like Canada and Central America, South America, Africa, and so on, that whilst the expression of creativity differs, of course, there are certain characteristics in common of dance, of music, and of visual art. Do you have any comments about why that might be so?
I actually don't. I think for me, probably because it's innate and it's embedded. It's something I can't explain. It's just there. And so it comes out in really interesting ways. Also the ability to see connections across different items. So I'll be in a meeting, there'll be 10 agenda items, and I can see how the first one connects with the third one, connects with the last one. And I'll be the only person in the room that draws those three things together and says, these things could be solved by A and B. And it's that sort of thinking that I never realized until sort of as I got, into my 30s, was like, actually, that is Indigenous thinking. That is that holism. That is that synthesis, the ability to see process and to see connections that aren't visible, perhaps, well, that others couldn't see as being visible too. But I think with creativity, it's a form, I don't know, it's a safe place, it's a peace place. You go into it and you can create and design and identify. And I think it's probably one of the things in my professional career that have been advantageous. In my teaching, I have very creative assessment tasks, which draw out the best in the students and challenge them and push them that little bit further. And I just seem to be able to do that year on year and time on time. But because it's so embedded, it's probably nothing that I can explain consciously.
Touché. But you've been aware of?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Forever?
Absolutely. And that's probably what got me into marketing. I love colours and images and the whole visual elements of design, and then obviously with ads and music and the like, and the way that these things could come together to make you, or to provoke different feelings and different points of escape, I think, throughout the day. I've moved into an area called social marketing, which is focusing on behaviour change to improve people's quality of life. And so I very much focus on ways, my main passion area is about widening participation, increasing participation of people from disadvantaged groups in higher education, which includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I think what I've been able to draw across from marketing is this idea of how can you create persuasive, engaging, inviting pieces and snapshots of information that in that moment can change people's worldview, can change people's outlook, to stimulate and prompt a change, or even just to get them to think, or grab their attention.
That's a perfect connection to getting to better together. I mean, the whole notion of better. It's interesting, lots of people have, in terms of worldview, a worldview about marketing as something that's like avaricious, that we've actually ceded our responsibilities to this nebulous thing called the market. I can't make a decision anymore. The market will do so. Yeah.
And I think the main thing is that among marketing, marketing needs rebranding. There is an absolute stigma around marketing, and no doubt about that. And it probably doesn't do justice to what marketing is about and what it can do. It's based in anthropology, in social psychology, and there's economic rationalist aspects to it as well. But increasingly amongst social marketers, there's also, we bring into our teaching and into our research this social consciousness and ethics around, and morality around what is right, what we should do, and what are the actual limits of what we do. Why we do what we do. But that notion that we're sort of absconding from responsibility, we're all care and no responsibility, and we just say, okay, the market will decide. I often start my lectures by saying, we don't all, drink from the fountain of economic rationalism. We don't all drink from the fountain of Adam Smith, and we increasingly have found a way to sort of, I think, inject this 21st century thinking and this sense of morality into it. I know that our students like it. I know that students love it when we talk about social marketing, we talk about big social issues and how we can use our tools and techniques for the greater good. And that's where we see our students thrive, and that's where they want to go. And that's the modern day business too. I mean, the reality is business models have changed hugely. And there is a moral and social agenda. It used to just be the triple bottom line, but I think it's just embedded in what we do. We should all do something that gives back. We should all be doing something that, I guess in some ways has positive consequences for others other than our customers and other than our shareholders.
You talked just now about interconnectivity and the notion, if you will, of not three separate things like people, planet, and profit, but a synthesis of those into something else. What might that something else be, do you think?
Oh, nameless, really. It's just a good point, because it sort of brings up that idea is, are things all comprised of parts, and is the sum of all parts equal to the whole? I don't know. I think that we're perhaps moving into a different stage of being, in that there is growing, people I think are becoming more comfortable with complexity. I think sometimes we break things into its component parts, like people and profit or the 4 Ps or whatever, because they're pedagogically easy to teach. We use them because it's easy to communicate. It doesn't mean they are everything that's in there. And I think that when your understanding matures and develops, you start to understand the complexity of all these types of intersecting points, and also how when they're all joined up and they're all synthesized together, the sum it is greater than the sum of all its parts that are a part of it too. I'm not quite sure, because I find I myself struggle with that space between breaking things into its component parts, that mechanistic view, and that helps to communicate. But then at the same time, understanding that what we're dealing with is phenomena that are far greater than how we've deconstructed them. And maybe it's deconstruction and reconstruction. I haven't resolved that within myself and within my own worldview. And I think, or worldviews plural, because I think that in a professional sort of setting and in a teaching setting, that worldview looks a certain way. In a personal setting, it's quite different. And in my own sort of professional writing provocations and things like that, it is a little bit different as well, because the audience is different. And I think it sort of links back to that first question about meeting people where they're at. Some people are very conscious of their worldview, are very woke to how it's changed over time or where they sit, and are reflective, whereas others aren't. So I guess I write for audiences that way, in terms of trying to meet them where they're at, and also not to push my, where I'm at in my life is my business and mine, and where they're at is theirs. So it's about not interrupting their journey and not taking away their innocence in some ways if they're not ready for it. Life brings enough into us to make it a trauma or whatnot, or situations to make us rethink what we are and why we do what we do.
A wise American philosopher once said that maturity is the ability to hold to different worldviews at the same time, preferably conflicting. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, I found out on my own life journey that I seem to be able to hold different worldviews. And in fact, I worked in the United States for almost a decade, and I was offered a job there on the grounds that I was able to synthesize. I had the ability. And the president of the university said, it's interesting. He said, I've noticed this with other Australians. He said, we Americans are extraordinarily good analysts, but we actually lack the capacity to synthesize. And you seem to have this particular competency of synthesis. Again, my experience of working with Indigenous peoples around the world is that indeed that's so, that there is not Australians, but I mean Indigenous people generally have this much greater capacity to synthesize. And maybe in some senses that's been a fault and a lack of analysis. And maybe it would be good conflictually if we could actually have both and then deal with them.
Yeah. And I think it sort of comes back to that notion of I guess that dominant knowledge system sort of looks a certain way, and it's been designed that way. And the way it's been designed is sort of that Indigenous synthesis view and holism view is at the margins, and it's only engaged with infrequently. I recently did a presentation where they would and showed what's called systems thinking. And I crossed it out, and it says traditional thinking and systems thinking. I crossed it out and said, this is Aboriginal thinking. This idea of holism and synthesis and process is it? And then I showed a model of Indigenous thinking and the focus on the non-verbal and the visual displays of to encourage behaviour change. And I think it was quite new to most of the audience because they hadn't ever considered that it always has been and always will be Indigenous ways of knowing and being that are out there. But it's certainly something, again, as an embodied element. It's not something that you consciously do. It's just sort of something that is a natural part of you that comes out. It's not always recognised, I guess, in different workplaces, and is perhaps not capitalised on. And it's quite interesting because most universities around the country these days are very much focused on critical and creative thinking and empowerment, and those two big graduate attributes bring together this idea of the ability to synthesise, to see disparate parts, identify how to bring them together. And it's like bricolage. It's this idea of finding what's around you, piecing it together, stitching it together, patchworking it together into something that works. And that sort of pragmatism is perhaps what underpins synthesis. And it's interesting when you were saying they're your own experiences in different countries. And perhaps it's simply been a case of Australia being, small population, large geographic area. We've all had to survive. We've all had to find our ways to create our worlds around us. And so that bricolage approach of piecing together what we have and making it work, in making it fit for purpose, is perhaps something that sort of underpins that sort of thinking.
I wonder if that, upon reflection, isn't a good way of talking more about what it is we could learn interculturally.
Yeah.
Of saying, look, there are some really profound issues here. It's not just art or coal fire burning or whatever. Yeah. It's that there is this notion of a fundamental human capacity, the difference between what we have done, I think, in education in the so-called Western world, which is a focus on analysis and numbers. We count stuff all the time, compared to this extraordinary qualitative ability to synthesize. Maybe that's a new point of entry in terms of this debate of reconciliation, for instance.
Yeah, and I think it fits in with that recognition that there's more than one knowledge system,
right,
that there is a dominant one, and that recognition that universities as an education system perpetuate it over time, that we teach our research students, for example, about, how to do statistical analysis. Our journals will only publish papers, I have a preference anyway for papers that have numbers in them rather than those that have words in them. So there's this whole group of systems around that prevent an opportunity to showcase synthesis and what it means. And as a result, in some ways, we educate it out of people, and then we don't have an outlet for people to express it so that it can be valued and can be seen. So I think it's those intersecting sort of systems that come together that silence it in many ways. And that's why these types of discussions, that's why I love the rise of podcasts, because there's something authentic in them and there's something raw. And in that moment, that's where those people were. And it allows for explanations that are just, I don't know if they're possible in the English language and possible on paper or in print.
The point about language is extraordinarily important, isn't it? I mean, there are lots of things that we are so limited in any particular language that we can't shift to another one, and therefore we can't understand even the premise. I mean, I think of words in Spanish like simpático or in German Zeitgeist. I mean, they're just words that have no English equivalent, at least that I know of. And that must be particularly true of Aboriginal languages, and I emphasize languages, that in essence their vocabulary was so different. I mean, lack of exposure to machines and other things, science itself. What are your views on where we can go with such differences in language?
And I think language is such an interesting topic because it constrains and determines how we express it. And English language conventions, the emphasis on active voice rather than passive voice. For example, in our own software, it doesn't like us writing in passive voice. It identifies it. And what that does, though, is it changes the nature of the dialogue and it changes the nature of our expression. And I do sometimes myself, even in my writing, find it difficult to express what I'm thinking about or the meaning of what I'm talking about. And so I've gone to the other extreme of becoming, as I've been described, as a wordsmith. And it's like, that's simply because I can't find the words in the language and the combination of them that explain what this phenomena, that explain what is going on. And so there is a need for some elaboration to grab your attention, because if you write everything in lay speak, then you sort of skim across the surface and you don't get to understand the phenomena itself. But this idea of the English language being a system that's hidden in the obvious, and most of us do not understand the constraints that it puts on our expression, our understanding, our comprehension, like you said, about understanding certain premises, is, I think, such a fundamental aspect of it. And I think that, that perhaps is why there is biases in the literature, is simply that we can't express what we're trying to explain and what we mean by it. And sometimes you see in certain sort of fields or areas of research, the same questions being asked over and over again, and the same answers being given, slightly phrased differently. But the fact is people often don't connect the meaning up as being the same sort of thing. So I think language constrains not only our ability to express what we see in phenomena around us, but our ability then to communicate it to others.
One of the aspects, I'm a Celt. I come from the west of England, although I shouldn't say west of England. I'm west of England. I'm Cornish, born and bred. And one of the traditions of the Cornish, or two traditions really, one is storytelling and the other one is song. I trained just as I became a scientist in agriculture from a farming background, so I studied singing. Not traditional singing that went on in our villages, but opera. And one of the things about that for me was that when you learn to sing formally, you don't move. And one of the things about, again, Indigenous music is that singing and dancing go together.
Yeah.
I've spent hours standing there next to a piano thinking this is really foolish, because I'm actually personally moved by the music and I want to move myself around the place. And opera to me actually gives you that possibility, so that you have visual art and movement and singing and colour and movement, as Barry Humphries once said. And that's one of the things to me, again, that I find incredibly appealing about Indigenous creativity, that dance and singing come together.
Yeah, because I don't think they're one-dimensional. They can't be. And the heart and the head, you're winning people's hearts and minds, and your own heart and mind through that process. So it's almost like you bring it together. So I'll link it back. So linking, when I teach social marketing, it's about hearts, minds, and hands. It's about winning people's hearts in order to prompt change, their minds in order to do change, but their hands in order to actually activate the change itself. So thinking, feeling, and doing, coming together in that sort of one point. And that's the sweet spot that brings about behaviour change, and hopefully sustained behaviour change for people, voluntarily to do those things. And I think it was really interesting, because I didn't ever notice that point, like you said, that you stand still in one place, that you're not actually moving and singing at the same time. But I think, again, it's that synthesis, it's that bringing together, that things aren't mechanistic, they're not parts that you then bolt on together, but they are all one and of the same thing. And I think the singing and the dancing together, apart from freedom of expression and actually being in touch with the feeling and the thinking and the sort of the singing at the same time, again, is that synthesis. It's that natural state that things are together, not apart.
I have really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you. It's gone all sorts of different directions that I hadn't planned, which just goes to show you shouldn't plan a conversation.
That's probably a good thing. No, this has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Come again. Thank you for listening to this episode of Getting to Better Together. I look forward to your company when next we have a conversation that exposes, as it were, people's views, their values, their beliefs in relation to how do we get to better together. Thank you and goodbye.